Tonight, we quietly step into another world, not a world of kings or castles, not a world of gold or grand feasts, but something much simpler, and in its own way, something much more real. Tonight, we step into the world of ordinary people, people who woke each morning to the smell of cold ashes and damp earth, people whose hands were rough and whose days were long, people whose meals were humble and whose pleasures were small. We are stepping very gently into the life of a peasant in medieval Europe, into the kitchen and the fields and the hearth, into the quiet rhythms of a life built around bread and broth and the slow turning of the seasons. There is no rush here, there is no drama here, there is only the soft settling of a world that moved slowly, that breathed slowly, that ate slowly and worked slowly and rested when it could. So let yourself settle now, too. Let your shoulders drop, let your breathing slow, and listen, if you will, to the quiet sounds of another time. It begins, as most days in the medieval village began, before the light has fully come. The darkness outside is thick and unbroken, the kind of darkness that modern eyes have almost forgotten, a darkness without electric light, without the orange glow of distant cities, without screens or street lamps, or the faint blue brightness of a phone. It is simply dark, deeply and completely dark, the way the world used to be when night fell. And in that darkness, inside a small cottage made of timber and wattle and daub, a fire has been burning low through the night, its embers still faintly orange beneath a fine dusting of ash, still breathing out just enough heat to keep the single room of the cottage from becoming too cold. The walls of the cottage are close. They are not made of stone, not in this village, not in most villages, because stone is expensive and difficult to work, and the people who live here have neither the time nor the money to build in stone. Instead, the walls are made of a wooden frame, packed with a mixture of clay and straw, and sometimes animal dung, all smoothed over and dried into something solid enough to keep out the worst of the wind, if not the cold entirely, and certainly not the damp. The roof above is thatch, bundles of dried straw or reeds tied and layered carefully, so that rain runs off the outside while the inside stays mostly dry. Smoke from the fire has no chimney to escape through, not in the oldest cottages, and so it drifts upward and hangs in the rafters, slowly seeping out through small gaps in the thatch, leaving behind a permanent faint smell of wood smoke that has worked itself into every surface, into the walls, into the clothing folded nearby, into the straw of the sleeping pallets, into the very air of the room itself. You would notice the smell first if you stepped inside. Wood smoke and something earthy beneath it, the smell of bodies and animals, and damp wool and old grain. Not an unpleasant smell exactly, just a very human one, the smell of people living close together with everything they have, in a space not much larger than a modern bedroom. The floor is packed earth, worn smooth by years of feet, swept as clean as it can be, with a bundle of twigs tied together into a broom, though there are always bits of straw and mud near the door where people and sometimes animals come in from outside. Along one wall, there are sleeping pallets, simple rectangles of rough linen stuffed with straw, perhaps with a thin woolen blanket folded over them, and on these pallets a family lies sleeping still, 2 adults and perhaps 3 or 4 children, huddled close together in the way that people sleep when warmth is something to be kept carefully. Near the center of the room, or sometimes off to one side, is the hearth. This is the most important thing in the cottage, the heart of everything, the source of warmth and light and cooked food. It is a simple thing, just a low area of flat stone or hard-packed earth where the fire burns, with perhaps a few larger stones arranged around it to help contain the coals, and above it, hanging from a hook fixed into a beam above, a heavy iron pot. The pot is black with years of use, its surface rough and pitted, and it hangs on its hook at just the right height above the fire, low enough to feel the heat, high enough not to scorch. Slowly, in the darkness before dawn, a woman stirs. She does not leap up. She moves gradually, the way a person moves when they are used to waking early, when the body knows before the mind does that the day must begin. She pushes back the thin blanket and sits upright on her pallet, breathing in the smoky air, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. She reaches toward the hearth, not far to reach in this small room, and she pokes gently at the embers with a stick, coaxing them back to life. A small orange glow brightens. She leans forward and breathes carefully onto the coals, just gently, just enough, and a thin flame appears, wavering and pale, and she feeds it a few small sticks she has kept nearby and watches it grow. Fire is precious. A fire that goes entirely cold is a serious thing, because starting a new fire from scratch takes time and effort, the striking of flint against steel, the nursing of a tiny spark into something that will catch and hold. So the fire in the hearth is tended like a quiet companion, never left to die entirely if it can be helped. Through the night it breathes softly on its own, and in the morning it is woken again like someone sleeping beside it. When the fire has steadied itself into something reliable, the woman stands, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, and moves through the half-dark of the cottage toward where the food is kept. Food is kept carefully in a medieval peasant household. Carefully and with great attention, because there is not much of it, and what there is must last. Grain is the most important thing, and it is stored in a rough wooden chest or in sacks made of coarse linen, kept as dry as possible, which is not always easy in a damp climate. There may be dried beans or peas in a clay pot covered with a piece of cloth. There may be dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, thyme and sage and perhaps some dried chamomile, gathered in the summer and preserved against the winter. There may be a small amount of salt, kept very carefully in a little wooden box or a clay vessel, because salt is not cheap and is used sparingly. A pinch here, a pinch there, never wasted. There might be an onion or two, stored in a net or a basket, their papery skins slightly soft. There might be a turnip or a parsnip from the garden, round and pale and firm, or a handful of dried mushrooms that were gathered from the edges of the woods in autumn and strung up to dry in the smoke. There is probably some lard or fat, a small amount, rendered from pig fat if the family was lucky enough to keep a pig and lucky enough to slaughter it before winter. And there is bread, if yesterday's baking left any. The woman reaches for the grain first. She takes a measure of it in her hands, not a large measure, not more than is needed, and she carries it to the quern, the hand mill, a simple device made of two round stones, one sitting on top of the other, with a hole in the top for pouring grain through, and a handle fixed to the upper stone for turning. She begins to grind. The motion is slow and circular, one hand on the handle, the stone turning, the grain being crushed between the two surfaces, the coarse flour collecting in a shallow depression or cloth below. The sound is a low, steady grinding, rhythmic and soft, not loud enough to wake the sleeping children, just a quiet presence in the morning room alongside the crackling of the young fire. This is how flour is made in a household like this one, in a village where there is no windmill near enough to walk to, or where the miller's fee is too high for today's needs. The quern is slow, and the flour it produces is coarse, flecked with bits of brawn and sometimes tiny fragments of stone worn from the grinding surfaces themselves. It is not the white, fine flour of bakeries and wealthy kitchens. It is a rough, gray-brown flour that makes a dense, heavy bread, a bread that sits solid in the stomach and does not go stale quickly. A bread that is very good at keeping hunger at bay for a long time. The grinding takes a while. It always takes a while. There is no rushing it. Outside, the sky has begun to lighten almost imperceptibly, a faint gray at the horizon where the darkness is a little thinner than the rest. Birds have begun to move, not singing yet, just rustling and shifting in the thatch above. The village is still quiet, though in the cottage next door and the one beyond it, similar mornings are beginning in similar ways, similar fires brightening, similar mills turning, similar hands reaching for the same simple ingredients that will make the same simple meals that have been made here for generations. Not much changes in a medieval village from one year to the next. The same fields are plowed in the same way. The same crops are planted in the same seasons. The same meals are cooked in the same pot over the same kind of fire. There is a deep comfort in that repetition, even if the people living it do not think of it as comfort, even if for them it is simply life. When enough flour has been ground, the woman sets it aside and turns to the pot. She fills it with water, not from a tap, of course, but from a wooden bucket that was filled the evening before from the well at the center of the village, or from the stream that runs along the edge of the common land. Water is carried always in buckets or clay jars, and it is heavy, and the carrying of it is part of every day's work without exception. The bucket is nearly full still, which is good. She adds more than enough to cover the dried peas and beans she measured out last night and left soaking in a smaller vessel, because soaking dried legumes overnight softens them and makes them easier to cook, easier to chew, easier for the body to manage. She lifts the smaller vessel and pours the soaked peas, along with their cloudy soaking water, into the larger pot, and she hangs the pot back on its hook above the fire. The peas will cook for a long time, hours perhaps, slowly softening in the heat until they break down into something thick and gentle, a kind of pottage, which is what most meals in a household like this one essentially are. Some version of pottage, some version of things simmered together in water until they become soft and edible and filling. Pottage is the word that medieval people used, and it covered a very wide range of things, from the thinnest, palest broth with barely anything in it to a thick, almost solid mass of grains and vegetables that could be eaten with a spoon, or when thick enough, sliced or scooped with a piece of bread. What went into pottage depended entirely on what was available, which meant it changed with the season and with the family's particular circumstances and with how the harvest had gone that year. But it was always there, always the pot on the fire, always the slow simmering, always the same basic approach. Take what you have, put it in water, cook it slowly, eat it. The children are beginning to wake now. One of them, the eldest, sits up on the pallet and rubs her eyes with small fists, looking toward the fire with the particular unfocused expression of someone not quite awake yet. She is perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with hair that wants combing and bare feet that will feel the cold of the earthen floor when she stands. She sits for a moment, gathering herself, and then she slides off the pallet and comes to stand near the fire, holding her hands toward its warmth, not speaking, just warming herself in the slow, quiet way of early morning. Her mother hands her a small task, because children in a household like this one always have tasks. There is always something that needs doing. Today the task is simple. Go to the garden behind the cottage and find whatever is growing that can be added to the pot. This time of year, in the middle of a gray autumn, there is not much, but there is something. There is almost always something if you look carefully. Leeks, perhaps, which are hardy and survive cold weather well, their long green tops still standing in the turned earth of the kitchen garden. Or kale, whose tough, dark leaves only get sweeter after the first frost. Or perhaps a few smallish turnips that were missed during the main harvest and left in the ground. The girl wraps a piece of cloth around her shoulders and slips outside into the cool morning air, and she moves through the garden quietly, pulling up a leek by its white base, picking a few large kale leaves, finding a small turnip that gives a satisfying little resistance before coming free of the earth. She carries them back inside, cradling them against her chest, and sets them near the fire where her mother is waiting. The leek is trimmed and sliced, the green tops and the white base both used, nothing wasted. The kale leaves are torn roughly, stems removed, and set aside for the animals. The turnip is peeled with a small knife, carefully, taking as thin a skin as possible so that none of the flesh is lost, and then cut into small pieces. All of it goes into the pot, joining the soaking peas in the water above the fire. The father adds a stick or two to the fire, building it up a little, and then he wraps himself in his coat and his worn leather boots, and he goes out to the barn, if there is one, or to the small pen behind the cottage, where the animals are kept, to see to them before the day properly begins. Let yourself breathe with this morning for a moment. The fire is burning with a steady, even warmth now. The pot is beginning to heat, a few slow bubbles forming at the bottom and rising through the peas and vegetables, the surface just barely starting to tremble. The smell of the leek is coming into the room, soft and green and a little sweet, mixing with the wood smoke that is the permanent background note of this place. Outside, the sky has lightened further, a pale gray-white that is not yet sunrise but is no longer night, the kind of light that comes before the sun but carries its promise. The children are all awake now, moving around the small room in that gentle, unhurried way of children who have nowhere particular to be quite yet, who are waiting for breakfast before anything else begins. The youngest sits on the pallet still, pulling at a loose thread on the blanket. The middle one, a boy, has gone to stand at the door and look out at the village, which is beginning to show signs of waking. A dog trotting between two cottages, a thin plume of smoke rising from a chimney down the lane. Breakfast is not a complicated thing. In a peasant household, breakfast is most often what was left from the day before, if anything was left, or a simple piece of bread if there is bread, or a bowl of pottage if the pot has been going long enough. This morning, the pottage is not yet ready. It needs more time, so the mother brings out the bread that was made 2 days ago, a round, dark loaf that is beginning to go stiff but has not gone bad, and she cuts slices from it with the knife, sawing slowly through the dense crumb, the crust resisting a little before giving way. The bread is heavy and brown and smells faintly of the fire it was baked near, because in a household without an oven, bread is not baked in an enclosed oven the way we might imagine. In many cottages, bread is baked directly on a flat stone near the fire, or under a clay dome placed over the coals, or in a covered pot, or sent to the village baker's communal oven on baking day, when the baker allows villagers to use it for a small fee or a portion of dough. The result is not always perfectly even. Sometimes the bottom is a little darker than the rest. Sometimes the inside is a little more dense, but it is real bread, and it is filling, and it is made from what the family has ground with their own hands. The slices of bread are handed around, one for each person, and they are eaten as they are without butter, because butter is not always available in this household, and when it is used carefully and sparingly. Sometimes the bread is dipped into the pot of cooking pottage to soften it a little, letting it absorb some of the warm liquid and become easier to chew. The stale bread soaks up the broth beautifully, swelling a little, softening, becoming something between bread and porridge. And it is good, in the way that simple things eaten when hungry are always good. There is nothing to drink with breakfast except water, or perhaps, if they are lucky, a small amount of ale. Ale in medieval Europe is not quite what we think of when we think of ale today. It is lighter, thinner, less alcoholic, made by fermenting a grain mash that has been cooked and cooled and mixed with a small amount of something sour or fermented to start the process going. It does not keep very long, a few days at most, before it begins to turn, but while it is fresh, it is a mild, slightly sweet, slightly sour drink that is perfectly safe to consume and provides a small amount of nourishment beyond just water. Children drink it too, because the water in many medieval villages is not always reliably clean, and ale, having been heated during its making, is often safer. Even young children might have a very weak ale in the morning, watered down further, just something other than plain water. But not everyone has ale every day. On many mornings, it is just the bread and the water and the pot simmering on the fire, and that is enough to begin a day. Gently, the day begins to open. The father has come back from the animals and has eaten his bread, and now he must go to the field. The fields that peasants work are not small private gardens, though they have those too, but large open fields that are managed collectively by the village, divided into long strips, each family working their strips alongside their neighbors' strips, everyone plowing and planting and harvesting in a coordinated rhythm that has its own kind of logic. The work varies by season, and right now, in autumn, much of the heavy harvest work is done, but there is still the turning of the soil for next year, the collecting of stubble and straw, the preparation of the land that will lie fallow, the maintenance of fences and drainage ditches that keep the fields working properly. He goes. The children go, those who are old enough to help with something. The younger ones stay with the mother, who has a full day of her own work ahead of her, work that is no less demanding for being done close to home. She stirs the pottage. She stirs it with a long wooden spoon, the handle darkened with years of use, the bowl of the spoon stained from countless pots of colored broth. The stirring is slow and circular, like the grinding of the quern, like so much of the physical work in this world, repetitive and steady, and requiring no particular thought, but constant, gentle attention. She moves the spoon through the thickening liquid, feeling the resistance as the peas begin to break down, scraping the bottom of the pot to make sure nothing is catching and burning, lifting the spoon and watching the pale, thick broth drip slowly back in. The pottage is beginning to smell of itself now, moving past the initial green freshness of the leek into something warmer and rounder. The starchy sweetness of the breaking down peas, the earthiness of the turnip, the slight bitterness of the kale softened by heat into something almost nutty. It fills the small room with its warmth, not just in the sense of temperature, but in the sense of presence, the way a pot on the fire makes a room feel inhabited and cared for. She adds a pinch of salt. Just one pinch, pressed between thumb and forefinger, the crystals dissolving almost immediately into the hot liquid. She adds a sprig of dried thyme from the bundle hanging above, crumbling it between her palms so that its tiny gray-green leaves fall into the pot like rain, releasing their dry, faintly dusty fragrance into the steam. And then she steps back and lets the fire do its work, because that is the nature of pottage. It does not require constant attendance, just occasional checking, occasional stirring, occasional adjustment of the fire. She sits for a moment near the hearth. The youngest child has fallen back asleep on the pallet. The room is quiet except for the fire and the pot and the distant sound of something outside, a bird, a cart perhaps somewhere down the lane. She closes her eyes for just a moment and lets the warmth of the fire rest against her face, and you can imagine it very well, the way the warmth of a fire feels when you are tired and the room is quiet, how it touches the cheek and the forehead like something patient and kind. In the quiet of the morning, it is easy to understand why the hearth was so important in a medieval household, why it occupied the center not just of the room, but of daily life. It was everything at once, the source of heat and light and cooked food, the place where people gathered when they were cold, the place where the sick were brought to rest near its warmth, the place where mothers nursed their babies and grandparents sat in the evenings. A fire meant survival. A fire meant dinner. A fire meant the family was still managing, still holding on, still here. She opens her eyes again and stands. There is more to do. Outside, the morning has fully arrived now, the sky a flat pale white with no sun visible through the clouds. The kind of sky that suggests rain later, but not yet. A sky that gives enough light to work by without any warmth or brightness. The village is properly awake now, sounds coming from various directions, the sound of a hammer somewhere, the lowing of cattle being let out, a woman calling to someone from a doorway, a dog barking twice and then going quiet. The kitchen garden behind the cottage needs attention, even now in autumn, because there is always something to do in a garden, always something to pull or plant or cover against the coming frost. She bends to the soil, her hands moving through it with the familiarity of someone who has worked this same patch of ground for many years, pulling weeds that have come up between the remaining plants, checking the kale and the leeks that are still standing, covering some of the smaller seedlings with a layer of straw to protect them against the cold nights ahead. The soil is damp and dark, and it smells of itself, of the earth, of decomposing leaves and roots, and the endless patient work of the ground that feeds people and then feeds itself again. There are herbs in a corner of the garden, sage and thyme and something that might be hyssop, their woody stems going gray and stiff in the autumn cold. She pinches off a few sprigs to dry, to add to the bundles already hanging inside. Herbs are important, not only for flavoring food, but for the minor ailments of daily life. A tea of certain herbs for a stomachache, a poultice of others for a wound, the accumulated knowledge of generations stored in these small useful plants. The morning moves on gently. Around midday, the meal is ready, or as ready as it will be, because pottage is somewhat flexible in that regard, always ready to be eaten, and yet always benefiting from more time. The family does not always all come home for the midday meal, depending on how far the fields are and the time of year, but today the children come in, trailing mud on the earthen floor, and the father comes in shortly after, smelling of cold air and turned earth. The table is a simple board laid across two trestles, with a bench on either side. It is not a permanent piece of furniture in the way a dining table is today. It is assembled for meals and taken apart when not needed, freeing up the limited floor space of the cottage. There are no chairs, just the benches, and the family sits on them in a row on either side, the younger children perhaps sitting on stools or on upturned buckets. The bowls they eat from are either wood, turned on a lathe by someone with the tools and skill to do it, or pottery. Rough clay vessels fired in a simple kiln, brown or gray in color, unglazed on the outside, and perhaps lightly glazed on the inside. They are plain and serviceable, their surfaces stained with years of use, but they hold the pottage well, and that is what matters. The mother ladles the pottage into the bowls, a deep ladle, a generous serving, because dinner is the main meal of the day, and people who have been working since before dawn are hungry. The pottage is thick now. The peas have broken down into a dense, pale mass, and the vegetables are soft and yielding. The whole thing held together by its own starch into something that is almost more solid than liquid, with a few leek pieces still visible in the surface, and a slight shimmer where a little of the lard was added during the last hour of cooking. There are more slices of bread. The bread from 2 days ago is very stiff now and has been cut in thick slabs and laid beside the bowls, and it will be used partly to eat with, a piece of bread to scoop up pottage where the spoon cannot reach, or to mop the bowl clean at the end, and partly as a trencher, a base for eating, though in this very simple household the bowls serve that purpose well enough. They eat quietly. There is not much conversation at meals in a household like this, not because people are unfriendly, but because eating is a serious and focused thing when you are genuinely hungry, when food has required real work to produce, when the body needs its energy for the afternoon ahead. The sound of spoons against pottery, of bread being bitten through its tough crust, of the youngest child slurping from the edge of a bowl that is slightly too big for small hands. The pottage is good. It is simple, and it is good. The peas have a mild, floury sweetness to them that is very particular, the kind of flavor that appears when dried legumes are cooked long and slow, and the leek gives it a gentle savory note, and the kale has become almost tender, not bitter now, just green and soft. The salt brings it all together in the way salt always does, without making itself known, just quietly making everything else more itself. The thyme, dried and crumbled, has distributed itself through the whole pot, so that each bite has just a hint of it, woody and warm and faintly medicinal in the best way. They drink water with the meal, or ale if there is any left from the last batch. The children hold their wooden cups in both hands and drink in gulps between spoonfuls of pottage. When the bowls are empty, they are scraped clean. Nothing is left in the bowl if it can be helped. A finger drawn around the inner rim of a wooden bowl is perfectly ordinary table manners in this household, and the bread that has gone soggy in the bottom of a pottery bowl is eaten with particular care, pressed flat against the bowl with a finger to make sure none of the absorbed broth is lost. The meal is over in perhaps 20 minutes. Not long, not a leisurely lunch by any measure. But it is a pause, a real pause, a gathering of the family in the middle of the day around the shared warmth of food, and that has its own quietness and its own meaning. Slowly, the afternoon begins. The father goes back to the fields. The older children go back to whatever tasks were set for them. The mother remains, because there is always more to do inside, and she sits near the fire again with her spindle, spinning thread from the rough, uneven wool that was shorn from their single sheep in the summer and has been washed and combed and is now being drawn out between her fingers into something long and thin and usable. The spindle turns, the thread grows, and it is another kind of rhythm, another repetitive motion, with another kind of quiet sound. The soft hiss of wool being drawn through fingers, the faint clicking of the spindle against the rim of a basket. The fire is still going, of course, though it has been banked down a little now that the cooking is done. The bigger logs put on to burn slowly and maintain the heat without requiring much attention. The pot is still hanging, now with whatever is left of the pottage, which might be eaten again in the evening with fresh bread, or with the addition of something else, an egg perhaps, if the chickens have given one, or a small amount of dried meat crumbled into the broth to give it a little more body. This is worth staying with for a moment, this quality of repetition and reuse that runs through every aspect of food in a medieval peasant household. A pot of pottage is not made and eaten in one sitting and discarded. It is made and eaten in part, and then added to, and simmered again, and eaten again. A loaf of bread is not discarded when it goes stale. It is soaked in broth, crumbled into soup, used as a thickener for other dishes, eaten harder and harder until the very last crumb is gone. Animal fat is not wasted, but rendered carefully and stored and used to cook with, to enrich a thin broth, to grease a baking surface. Nothing is thrown away if there is any use left in it. This is not a political or moral statement in a medieval village. It is simply how things are, because resources are limited and the consequences of waste are real and near. But there is something in it that feels right, something in the total attention paid to food, the complete respect for what it takes to grow and prepare and cook it. The afternoon moves as afternoons do in this season, slowly and without much changing light, the sky staying its uniform pale gray, the air getting colder as the afternoon deepens, the wind picking up a little, rattling the door of the cottage in its frame. The animals need tending again in the late afternoon. If the family keeps a goat, the goat must be milked. Goat's milk is a useful thing in a medieval peasant household. It can be drunk as it is, or made into a simple fresh cheese by letting it sour and then hanging it in a cloth to drain, or used to enrich pottage, added at the end of cooking in a thin stream that gives the broth a creamier quality. Cheese made at home is soft and fresh and mild, a very different thing from the aged hard cheeses that were made in larger quantities at monasteries or by people with more animals and more equipment. This cheese is eaten soon, within a day or two, while it is fresh and clean tasting, perhaps with bread and a little salt, or crumbled into a bowl of pottage to melt gently into the warmth. If there is a cow, and not every peasant family has a cow, because a cow is expensive to keep and requires more hay through the winter than a goat or a sheep, then the cow must also be milked and tended, brought in from wherever she has been grazing through the day if she has been out, or checked on in the small byre attached to the back of the cottage or nearby. Keeping animals close to the house through winter is not merely convenience. The body heat of animals in an attached byre actually helps keep the cottage a little warmer, the warmth radiating through the shared wall, a simple and effective arrangement. Pigs are perhaps the most common large animal in a medieval peasant's life, because pigs are remarkably efficient creatures when it comes to converting what humans cannot eat into something humans can. They eat scraps and waste and the slops from the kitchen and the windfall apples and the spoiled grain, and they grow fat on it. And in November, when they cannot easily be fed through the winter and have reached their best weight, they are slaughtered. The slaughter of the pig is one of the significant moments of the autumn calendar. a serious and practical act that fills the household with an abundance of meat and fat that will last, carefully preserved through the cold months ahead. But that moment comes a little later in the year, for now, if there is a pig, it is still in its pen behind the cottage, round and patient, eating its scraps and its slops, unaware of what autumn's end brings. The afternoon deepens toward evening. The mother has been working, spinning, and then mending a piece of clothing that needed attention. A tear in the knee of a child's breeches, where the fabric has given way, stitched carefully with a bone needle, and a length of thread pulled from a piece of worn cloth no longer useful for anything else. The fire has been built up again, responding to the cooling of the late afternoon, the room warming around it. The children come back in from whatever they have been doing, noisier now. The younger one's tired, the older one carrying something she found in the hedgerow on her way home. Some late blackberries, perhaps, the last of the season, a small and very sweet from the cold, just a handful of them cupped in her palms. She holds them out, and the family looks at them, these small dark berries, and they are divided carefully, a few for each person, and they are eaten one at a time, slowly, and they taste of autumn and sweetness and cold air, and they are a small pleasure, a real and genuine small pleasure, unremarkable in the way that the best small pleasures always are. Wild food of this kind, gathered from the edges of fields and from the woodland and the hedgerow, is an important supplement to the diet of people who live close to the land, particularly in autumn, when the countryside is generous with its last gifts before winter. Blackberries and elderberries can be eaten fresh or dried. Hazelnuts fall from their trees in the lanes and can be gathered by anyone who is there to pick them up. Cracked open with a stone to reveal the small white nut inside, sweet and slightly oily. Wild mushrooms appear after rain in the grassy edges of fields and at the feet of old trees. And if you know which ones are safe, and people who live near the forest do know, they can be gathered and eaten fresh or dried for later. Apples from the orchards, if the village has them, can be stored in a cool, dry place for weeks and eaten slowly through autumn. Crab apples, smaller and more astringent, can be cooked down into something edible with enough patience. Sloes, the small dark plums of the blackthorn hedge, are too bitter to eat raw, but can be made into something sweet and dark if you have the time and the patience. The landscape is not empty of food for those who know where to look and who have the time to look. And peasants who have lived in the same place their whole lives, and whose parents and grandparents lived there too, tend to know the landscape very well indeed. The evening meal is being prepared now. The pot has been going all day, and the pottage in it has become something richer and thicker than it was this morning, having had hours of slow cooking and the addition of a little water once when it seemed to be getting too low. The mother reaches into a small crock and pulls out a handful of dried mushrooms, the kind that were gathered earlier in the autumn and left to dry in the airy warmth of the cottage until they became papery and light, concentrating their flavor into something dense and earthy. She crumbles them slightly between her fingers and adds them to the pot, where they will soften in the hot liquid and release their smoky, woodsy flavor into the broth. She has a small piece of salted pork, very small, perhaps the size of 2 fingers, kept in the clay crock with the salt. It was salted down in the autumn to preserve it, rubbed all over with coarse salt, and pressed into the crock under a weight, where it will last for a good while if the salt has been applied properly. She cuts it thin, almost paper thin, with the knife, and adds those thin slivers to the pot as well. It is not enough to make the pottage meaty in any real sense. There is too little of it for that, but it is enough to add something to the flavor, a faint, savory depth, a little richness, the way a small amount of salt pork can change the character of a broth without actually making it into a meat dish. Fresh bread would be good tonight. The bread from 2 days ago is very hard now, good only for soaking. So she makes a flatbread instead, which is faster than a leavened loaf, requiring no time for rising, just flour and water and a little salt mixed together into a rough dough, then patted flat and laid on the hearthstone beside the fire, where it will cook in the dry heat, browning on one side and then the other, becoming something sturdy and chewy and faintly smoky at its edges, different from the loaf, but satisfying in its own way. The smell of bread cooking on stone is very particular and very good, a warm, slightly toasty smell that has nothing complicated about it, just grain transformed by heat into something ready to be eaten. The father comes home as the evening meal is nearly ready, coming through the door with the cold air following him in for a moment before the door is closed again. His boots muddy from the field, his hands chilled. He warms them at the fire and leans over the pot for a moment, smelling it, and he says nothing, because there is nothing that needs saying. It is dinner, and it smells good, and he is hungry, and that is enough. They gather around the table again, the same bowls, the same bench, the same family in the same arrangement. But the evening feels different from the midday meal, a little softer, a little slower. The light outside completely gone now, and the only light in the room coming from the fire, which makes everything amber and warm, and throws gentle shadows on the walls. Someone has set a small rushlight in a holder on the table, a rushlight being a simple thing made from a dried rush dipped in fat that burns with a small steady flame and gives just enough light to see by. Its flame barely moves in the still air of the room. The pottage is different now from this morning, richer from the long cooking, the mushrooms having given it a dark, earthy note, the thin slivers of salted pork dissolving into it, almost entirely except for a faint, meaty quality in the broth. The flatbread is warm and slightly smoky and tears apart easily, its interior soft despite its thin shape. The family eats more slowly now than they did at midday, not because they are less hungry, but because there is no particular reason to hurry, and the fire is warm, and the evening is quiet, and there is something restful about a bowl of warm food in a fire-lit room at the end of a long day of working in the cold. The children are tired. The youngest is half asleep already, leaning against the older sister on the bench, a spoon held loosely in a small hand. The father eats steadily and without rush, looking into the middle distance in the way of someone whose body is tired and whose mind has gone somewhere quiet. The mother moves between the fire and the table, making sure everyone has enough, sitting down herself only when the others have what they need. After the meal, what remains of the pottage is left in the pot, which will be hung lower on its hook through the night, so the embers keep it from spoiling, but do not cook it further. The bowls are wiped clean with a piece of rough cloth and stacked near the hearth. The table board is lifted off its trestles and leaned against the wall. The rushlight is pinched out carefully to save the remaining wick for tomorrow. Let yourself slow down now as the evening slows. The fire is the only light left, and it is generous with its warmth, but not extravagant with it, burning steadily at the rate of carefully laid wood, giving off the particular orange glow that open fires make, the way the flames move in the small invisible currents of air inside the room, rising and falling and twisting without any pattern, endlessly interesting and endlessly calming to watch. The family will not stay up very long. When there is no artificial light, and when the day begins before dawn, the evening does not extend very far into the night. People go to sleep when it is dark, or close to it, because there is little to do in the dark, and because sleep is efficient. Sleep is the body's way of restoring itself for another day of the same patient work. The pallets are unrolled, the thin blankets pulled over, the children settling in quickly the way tired children do, without complaint or ceremony. Before sleep, perhaps, someone might sit for a few more minutes by the fire. Perhaps the mother, who often seems to sit longer than the others, spinning a little more thread by the firelight, or simply sitting, looking into the flames in that particular way that people who live with fire look at it, not seeing it exactly, just resting against it, letting its steady warmth hold the day gently closed. The village outside is quiet now. The sounds that were present through the day, the voices and the animals and the footsteps on the packed earth lane, have all subsided. There is only the wind sometimes, moving through the thatch, and the distant sound of an animal somewhere, and the fire in the hearth, which does not stop its quiet work, which will go on burning through the night in its slow way, keeping the cold back from the sleeping family. Not much changes from one night to the next. Not much changes from 1 week to the next, in the broad and gentle sense. The pot is filled, and the fire is lit, and the grain is ground, and the bread is made, and the family gathers at the table and eats what there is. The rhythm of it is its own kind of peace, and so the first day settles into night, quietly and completely. Now let us go a little further into this world and take a closer look at what the food of a medieval peasant was, really more carefully, more slowly, the way you might sit with someone and let them tell you about it over a very long and unhurried evening. The most fundamental thing in the diet of almost every medieval peasant in Europe was grain. Grain in one form or another, prepared in one way or another, was the foundation of every single day's eating, from the bread that began the morning to the pottage that ended it, from the ale that was drunk between to the porridge that was sometimes made from it. Grain was life in the most literal possible sense, and the failure of the grain harvest was equally literally a matter of life and death. But what grain, and how was it used? The answer varied enormously depending on where in Europe one lived. In the warmer south, in the regions around the Mediterranean, wheat was more common, a grain that grows well in warm summers and produces a lighter, more digestible flour, and bread made from it is less dense and more familiar to modern tastes. But in the colder north, in England and northern France and the Low Countries, and across much of Germany, wheat was a luxury grain, grown of course but expensive, its bread often reserved for the wealthy. What ordinary people ate was rye and oats and barley. Rye is a remarkable grain in some ways, hardier than wheat, more tolerant of cold and damp, willing to grow in poorer soils where wheat would struggle. The flour it produces is darker and denser, and the bread made from it is correspondingly dark and heavy and slightly sour, with a particular flavor that is sharp and earthy and not like anything else. Rye bread keeps very well, staying edible for days longer than wheat bread, which is a practical advantage when baking happens infrequently. It is a bread that sits very solidly in the stomach and releases its energy slowly, which is exactly what a person doing physical labor from dawn to dusk needs. Oats are different again. Oats do not make a very good bread on their own because they lack the proteins that give bread its structure, but they make an excellent porridge, which was an important part of the diet in Scotland and northern England and other places where oats grew particularly well. Oatmeal porridge made with water is a very plain thing on its own, almost without flavor, needing salt at the very least to be palatable, but it is filling and warming, and it provides a steady, slow-burning energy that sustains work. Added to pottage, oats thicken it and give it body. Used as a thickener for broth or gravy, they dissolve into the liquid and make it heavier and more sustaining. Barley is another grain that was widely used, both for food and for ale making. Barley bread, like rye bread, is denser than wheat bread, but has a slightly sweeter, nuttier flavor. Pearl barley, which is barley with its outer hull rubbed off so the grain is smooth and round and white, is one of the best things for thickening soups and stews, because as it cooks, it swells and softens and releases a starchy substance into the liquid that makes everything around it thick and satiny. Even a very thin broth with almost nothing in it becomes something worth eating when a handful of pearl barley is added and cooked down until the grains are completely soft. And then there were other crops, used in ways that are somewhat different from how they might be used today. Maslin was a mixture of different grains, often rye and wheat, grown together in the same field, because this mixture was more reliable than either alone, the rye holding on in bad conditions and the wheat thriving in good ones, so that whatever the weather, something was harvested. Bread made from maslin flour was neither fully dark like rye bread nor light like wheat bread, but something in between, a medium-colored, medium-textured bread. That was the everyday bread of many peasant households. The bread made in this world was often what historians call a coarse bread, meaning it contained the whole grain, the bronze and the germ, along with the starchy interior, none of it removed by milling, because the milling techniques of the time did not allow for easy separation of the different parts of the grain. And actually, From a nutritional standpoint, this is not a bad thing because the bran and germ contain more vitamins and minerals and fiber than the white starchy core alone. The peasant's dark, heavy, coarse bread was in many ways more nourishing than the fine white bread that wealthy people ate, though of course the wealthy would not have thought of it that way. Let yourself imagine holding a piece of this bread. It is heavy in the hand, heavier than a modern slice of bread, denser in texture, and with a crust that is genuinely resistant, the kind of crust that requires real effort to bite through. The crumb inside is tight and moist, not dry, with a slightly gummy quality from the rye, and it pulls apart in thick, sticky pieces. The smell is of grain and something slightly sour, like sourdough, because before yeast was understood or isolated, bread was leavened with a piece of old dough saved from the previous baking, a piece that had been fermenting in the dough jar and which, when added to the new dough, made it rise slowly over many hours, producing a bread with the faint sourness that fermentation always brings. It is a real taste, this bread, a taste with character and depth, not the neutral softness of modern factory bread, but something that asserts itself, that asks to be chewed, that fills the mouth with its grainness before being swallowed. Eaten with pottage, dipped into broth, it becomes something completely different, softening in the liquid, absorbing flavor, becoming almost a part of the soup itself. And on its own, with nothing, just bread, it is enough for a hunger that is real and not merely habitual. Now let us think about the vegetables, which were the other great pillar of the peasant diet. The kitchen garden behind the cottage was not large, but it was deeply important, tended with real care and attention, because what grew in it was directly, immediately connected to what appeared on the table. The vegetables that grew in medieval peasant gardens were often different varieties from what we know today, selected over generations for hardiness and productivity in local conditions, rather than for flavor or appearance in a market, though of course, flavor mattered to the people eating them. Peas and beans were perhaps the most important vegetables in the garden because they are legumes, and legumes do something that most other plants cannot. They fix nitrogen in the soil as they grow, which is good for the earth around them, and more importantly, for the people eating them, they contain substantial amounts of protein, more than most vegetables, making them a crucial source of nourishment in a diet that did not include much meat. Dried peas and dried beans, stored through the winter, were the protein of poor people's food, the thing that gave substance and staying power to a diet that might otherwise be mostly starch. Field peas, small and gray-green when dried, were one of the most commonly grown varieties, cooked into the thick pea pottage that was a staple across much of northern Europe. Fava beans, large and flat and slightly bitter when fresh, were another common crop, dried and stored and added to soups and stews through the year. Lentils appeared in some regions. The pottage that came from these dried legumes, cooked down for hours until they became a thick, almost porridge-like mass, was filling and relatively nourishing, and had a mild, earthy flavor that was pleasant and easy to eat. Leeks were grown widely because they are hardy and remarkably tolerant of cold, continuing to grow and be usable well into the winter months when many other vegetables have given up. A leek pulled from a frozen garden, its outer layers perhaps a little frosted and needing to be stripped away, still has a perfectly good interior that when cooked becomes mild and sweet and almost silky, dissolving into a pottage and lending it a gentle flavor that is neither sharp nor bland. Leeks appear in almost every description of medieval peasant cooking, as common in the pot as bread on the table. Onions and garlic were grown and used as flavoring throughout this period, both in more southerly regions and in the north, because they are also hardy and keep reasonably well when dried properly, and because they make even a very plain broth taste of something. The smell of an onion being sliced in a small cottage is a very particular thing, sharp and immediate, filling the space quickly, and when it softens in the pot, that sharpness transforms into sweetness, the onion becoming something tender and mild and very pleasant. Cabbages and kale were cold weather vegetables that were grown widely because they asked very little of the soil and rewarded that minimal ask with large, usable leaves through autumn and winter. Kale especially is a vegetable of remarkable persistence, staying green and edible through temperatures that would kill most other plants, and in a medieval kitchen it was used simply and directly, stripped of its tough stems, roughly chopped or torn, added to the pot where it cooked down into something soft and dark green and slightly mineral tasting, adding nutrients and in color to what might otherwise be a very pale and monotonous bowl of broth. Root vegetables, turnips, and parsnips, and eventually carrots, though carrots in medieval Europe were often purple or white rather than the orange we know today, were grown in the garden and stored through winter in various ways, kept in root cellars or underground pits, where the earth's own mild temperature kept them from freezing and from rotting too quickly. A turnip pulled from winter storage and cut into a pot of pottage cooks down into something tender and slightly sweet, quite different from a raw turnip's sharpness, and its starchy flesh helps to thicken the pottage as well. All of these things, the peas and beans, the leeks and onions, the kale and turnips, make up the core of what a medieval peasant put in their pot, day after day and season after season, with the contents of the pot varying according to what was available at that particular time of year, what had been stored, what the garden was still producing, and what small additions could be made from other sources. Slowly, we turn to the question of meat. Meat is something of a complicated subject in the medieval peasant diet, because the answer to the question of how much meat a peasant ate depends enormously on the time period, the region, and the specific circumstances of the individual family. In general, and this is a gentle generalization that must be held loosely, ordinary peasants in medieval Europe ate much less meat than wealthy people and less than many people today, but they were not entirely without it, and they ate a wider variety of animal products than the modern imagination often allows. The animals most accessible to a peasant family were the ones they could keep themselves. Chickens were common, small, and inexpensive to feed, producing eggs through much of the year and providing meat when they were old enough to be eaten or when a culling was necessary. A chicken kept for eggs is a productive thing, given the small amount it costs to feed, and the eggs it produces are genuinely valuable, one of the most complete sources of nourishment that the diet of a poor family could draw on. An egg could be eaten boiled or fried on the hearthstone, or poached in a little water, or beaten into a broth to thicken and enrich it, or used to bind a simple mixture together. Eggs did not require elaborate preparation, and they cooked quickly, and they were good, simply good, in the way of ingredients that need nothing done to them to be worth eating. When a chicken was old and no longer laying well, it might be killed and cooked, a thin old bird put into the pot to make a long, slow broth, the tough flesh eventually softening enough to be edible, and the bones giving the broth a depth of flavor that plain water never has. Old chicken made into a stew that cooked for a very long time, with whatever vegetables were at hand and some herbs and salt, was a real meal, a better meal than pottage alone, though still a simple one. Pigs, as mentioned before, were slaughtered in autumn, typically in November, and the slaughter of the family pig was a significant event that was approached with a combination of practicality and something that might be called ceremony, an acknowledgement of what was being done and why. Nothing from the pig was wasted. The flesh was salted and smoked and stored. The fat was rendered into lard. The intestines were cleaned and used as sausage casings or for other purposes. The blood was mixed with fat and grain and herbs to make black pudding. The feet were pickled. The head was used to make a jellied preparation called brawn. Even the rind of the skin, when the fat was rendered out of it, could be eaten. All of this pork, carefully preserved with salt and sometimes smoke, represented the main supply of meat for the long months of winter. The salt pork that went into the pot in thin slices, the bacon hanging from the rafters, the small amount of rendered lard used to cook with, all of it came from that November pig and was rationed carefully to last as long as possible, ideally through to spring. The eating of this preserved pork through winter was not lavish. A small piece to flavor a pot, a thin rasher cooked until its fat ran out, and used to grease the baking stone, a little lard stirred into pottage to give it some richness. It was flavoring largely, rather than the main point of a meal, though on occasion, particularly at a feast day or a celebration, it might appear in larger quantities and be the center of the table rather than merely a contribution to it. Wild food supplemented the diet when opportunity allowed. A rabbit caught in a field trap, a pigeon that could be netted near a grain store, fish from a stream or a pond if the peasant had the right to fish there and the equipment to do it. These were additional sources of protein that arrived sporadically and unpredictably, but were welcome when they came. The right to hunt larger game, deer and boar, was severely restricted in medieval Europe and belonged almost exclusively to the nobility, so a peasant who took a deer from the lord's forest risked serious punishment. But smaller creatures were more accessible, and a resourceful person living close to the land knew how to find them. Fish deserves particular attention in the diet of medieval people because of the church calendar. The medieval Christian church required its followers to abstain from meat on Fridays and on certain other days throughout the year including the 40 days of Lent before Easter and the Advent period before Christmas. Together, these fast days, as they were called, added up to a large portion of the year, and on those days, meat could not be eaten. Fish, however, was permitted, being classified differently from the flesh of land animals, and so the demand for fish was enormous throughout medieval Europe, driving an extensive fishing and fish preservation industry. For coastal communities, fresh fish might be available, but for inland villages, fish meant preserved fish, primarily dried salt cod and herring. Salt herring, especially, was one of the most important foods in medieval Europe. A small, oily fish that was packed in barrels with layers of salt, preserved almost indefinitely, and exported across the continent. A humble and inexpensive food that kept fast days edible for people who would otherwise have had very little choice. The flavor of salt herring is strong, very salty, and very fishy, something that requires getting used to, but that has a particular richness from the natural oils in the fish preserved along with the flesh. Soaked in water to draw out some of the salt, then cooked simply in water or a little fat, salt herring provided protein and the fatty acids that the oily fish family is rich in. Dried salt cod, brought from the cold northern waters where it was caught in vast quantities, was another staple, requiring soaking for days in changing water to rehydrate and reduce the saltiness before being edible, but once treated this way, becoming a perfectly usable white fish that cooked gently in broth or was flaked into pottage or eaten simply with bread and salt. The flavor of prepared salt cod is mild and sweet, almost delicate, a very different experience from fresh cod, but good in its own way, and it kept essentially forever in its dried form, making it one of the most reliable preserved foods of the period. On fast days in a peasant household, dinner might be a bowl of pottage made with salt herring added instead of pork. The strong saltiness of the fish working through the broth and vegetables in a way that was completely distinct from a meat-based pottage, but no less satisfying in its different way. Or it might be a very simple meal of bread and saltfish and ale without anything else, because fast days were understood to be modest in what they offered, the simplicity being part of the point. The ale deserves more attention than it has received so far. Ale in medieval Europe was, as mentioned, a lighter and less alcoholic drink than modern beer, and it was made through a process that was common household knowledge rather than a specialist trade, though of course some people made better ale than others, and alehouses existed in villages where someone made more than their household needed and sold the surplus. The grain used for ale was usually barley, malted first by soaking it and allowing it to begin to sprout, which activates enzymes in the grain that convert some of its starches into sugars, and then dried in a kiln to halt the sprouting and lock in those sugars. This malted barley, when steeped in hot water and fermented, produces a drink that has body and a certain sweetness and a faint bitterness, and before hops were widely used to preserve and flavor ale, which happened later in the medieval period with the rise of hopped beer imported from the continent, herbs such as ground ivy and yarrow and various other plants were added to help preserve the ale and give it flavor. These herb-flavored ales, called gruit ales, had a more complex and less predictable flavor than modern beer, but they served the same purpose and were drunk by everyone, every day, as the ordinary accompaniment to food and work and daily life. Women were the primary brewers of ale in medieval villages, and the production of ale was a domestic task like baking or spinning, something done at home for the household's use, perhaps with a little extra to sell. The alewife, a woman who brewed and sold ale from her home, was a common figure in medieval English life, and the quality of her ale was regulated by local courts, which tested it regularly and fined those whose ale was weak or otherwise unsatisfactory. It was taken seriously because it was drunk so constantly by everyone. Making ale took time and attention, the mashing and sparging and fermenting and cooling all requiring specific conditions and a certain practiced knowledge. But it was also a reassuringly predictable process, the same steps producing more or less the same result each time, as long as the ingredients were good and the weather was cooperative. In cold weather, fermentation was slower. In warm weather, ale went off more quickly. The brewer learned to work with the seasons rather than against them. For children and for those who were ill, the ale might be diluted further with water, reducing its alcohol content even more and making it very mild indeed. The elderly and the sick might have weak ale given to them as a sustaining drink rather than a purely pleasurable one, a source of some nutrition and hydration when solid food was difficult. Water was drunk too, of course, but the quality of water in medieval villages was variable and unreliable, depending on how close the well or spring was to any source of contamination, how carefully the water source was maintained, and the general sanitary conditions of the village. Many people in the medieval period understood intuitively, even without the germ theory of disease, that water from certain sources made you ill, and they responded by drinking ale instead, which was safer because it had been boiled in its making. Milk was consumed where it was available, fresh from cow or goat, but it did not keep long without refrigeration and was often converted fairly quickly into cheese or butter rather than being drunk as a beverage. Fresh milk was a seasonal thing in many households, more available in spring and summer when cows and goats were giving their most, and less available or entirely absent in winter when their production dropped. Butter, made by churning cream until the fat globules clumped together and separated from the buttermilk, was a precious thing, sometimes salted to preserve it for longer use, and used carefully as a cooking fat or a spread for bread when there was enough of it. Honey was the primary sweetener in a world before cane sugar was widely available, and it was used when sweetness was wanted in a drink called mead made from honey fermented in water, in sweet preparations for the sick, in the small sweet things that appeared at celebrations and feast days. But honey was not cheap, and most ordinary households used it very sparingly. Sweetness as a flavor was rarer and therefore more prized, more associated with special occasions and celebrations, rather than being a constant presence in every meal the way it has become in modern times. Let the evening deepen a little more, We have been moving through the day and through the details of the food for some time now, and perhaps it is good to simply return to the cottage for a while, to the fire and the people and the quiet texture of the evening before we go further. The fire has been built up again for the evening, the larger pieces of wood that will burn slowly through the night already placed, and the room is at its warmest now. The heat it has been building all day, concentrated and comfortable. The children are all in their pallets, the youngest two already asleep, the older girl lying with her eyes still open, looking at the shadows the fire makes on the low ceiling above her, watching them move and shift in the way that firelight moves, never quite still, never quite predictable, like watching something that is alive and thinking its own slow thoughts. The mother and father sit near the fire, not speaking much, not needing to. He has his boots off and is working at a piece of wood with a small knife, not making anything in particular, just working the wood the way hands need to work after a day of heavier labor, shaping and smoothing and feeling the grain of it. She is still spinning, the spindle turning, the thread growing, her hands doing what hands do when they are well practiced at a thing, working without needing the mind's full attention, leaving the mind free to drift wherever it wants to go. It is a quiet hour, the quietest of the day. Outside, the village is almost entirely silent now. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, once, twice, and then stops. The wind has died down from the afternoon, and the thatch above is still. The fire is the loudest thing in the room, its steady, comfortable sound filling the space, thinking about food again, but gently now, not with the focused attention of cataloging and explaining, but with the softer attention of simply noticing. There are things about this diet that are worth sitting with, not in a comparative way or a judgmental way, but just as they are. The food of a medieval peasant was seasonal in a way that is very difficult for a modern person to truly understand. Seasonal eating today is often a choice, a preference, a marker of caring about food in a certain conscious way. For a medieval peasant, it was simply reality. You ate what the season offered because that was what existed. In summer, there were fresh green things, early peas and beans pulled young from the vine, fresh herbs, early carrots, soft salad leaves, the first of the summer berries, a richness and variety that must have felt very good after the long, monochromatic months of winter. In autumn, there was the harvest abundance, grain and root vegetables, and orchard fruit and nuts, everything at its most plentiful and most dense with nourishment. In winter, there was the gradual drawing down of stored things, the slow consumption of what autumn had provided, the dried peas and beans, and the salted pork and the root vegetables in their pit, the ale and the dried herbs and the hard cheese. In spring, before the new growing season had produced much, there was often what historians call the hungry gap, the weeks between when winter stores were running out and when the spring crops and the wild green things were ready to eat, a difficult time that required real management of what little remained. This cycle, this patient movement through the seasons with the food that each one offered, gave a texture to the year that was very different from modern life, where January and July are largely indistinguishable in what can be eaten. The first spring leeks, after months of winter root vegetables and dried peas, must have tasted remarkable, their fresh green sharpness a genuine awakening after the dense, starchy months of winter. The first summer strawberries, small and intensely sweet, must have been a real occasion of pleasure. The smell of the harvest, grain cut and bundled in the August heat, the village full of that particular sweet and dusty smell of cut grain, would have been the smell of security, of another year's survival established, of winter that could now be faced. The attachment to particular foods in a medieval village was not aesthetic in the modern sense, not about enjoying cooking or exploring cuisines, but something deeper and more practical, a relationship with the land and its seasons that involved real knowing, real dependence, real gratitude in some form, even if not expressed in those particular terms. And yet, with all that said, with all the hardship and limitation that such a diet implies, there is also something worth noticing in its fundamental rightness, its rootedness in real food, grown from real earth by real hands, its complete absence of the processed and the artificial and the far-traveled. A bowl of pottage made from peas grown in the garden behind the cottage, seasoned with herbs picked from the same garden, and salt preserved from the autumn, cooked in water drawn from the village well, eaten in a room warmed by wood cut from the nearby forest, is a meal that is entirely and completely of its place, connected from beginning to end to the specific patch of earth that produced it. There is a kind of integrity to that which is hard to articulate but easy to feel. Let yourself feel it now, if you will. The weight of the wooden bowl, the warmth of the pottage inside it, the particular smell of wood smoke and leek and thyme, the sound of the fire, the quiet of the room. Now let us move gently forward in the year just a little to see what changes with the seasons, because the changes are important and they are interesting and they are soothing in their own way, the rhythm of them. Winter has properly arrived. The air outside is cold enough to see the breath of anyone who steps out, a white cloud appearing and dissolving with each exhale. The ground is frozen hard in the mornings, the puddles in the lane sheeted with thin ice that cracks under the first foot to step on it. Inside the cottage, the fire burns all day and all night, never allowed to go out, because there is no longer any hour of the day that is warm enough to manage without it. The diet in winter is at its most limited and its most consistent. The pot on the fire holds pottage made from dried peas and beans, thickened with barley, flavored with a little salted pork and dried herbs, day after day in its slow variation, the flavors shifting slightly depending on what is added each morning, but the basic nature of the meal remaining constant. Root vegetables from the storage pit, turnips and parsnips, still firm and usable if checked regularly, are added when available. The kale in the garden, incredibly, is still standing, toughened by the cold into something almost leathery, but still providing its green presence in the pot. Bread is baked when it can be, though flour runs through the winter and must be used carefully. The proportion of rye to wheat shifts as winter progresses, as the lighter wheat flour runs lower, the bread getting darker and denser, and more emphatically rye-flavored. By deep winter, the bread might be almost entirely rye, very dense and very dark, and very good at its job of filling an empty stomach. The ale, if well managed, should still be available in winter, the fermenting process actually slowing down in the cold, which means the ale keeps longer. A household that planned well made a good batch of ale in autumn and has been drinking through it carefully, drawing from the barrel with a wooden cup, the ale cold now in the cold room, but still drinkable, still doing its job of nourishing and warming in a mild way. The pig was slaughtered in November, and its meat has been in salt since then, packed in the crock with the heavy crystals drawing out moisture and preventing spoilage. By the deep of winter, the saltiness has worked all the way through the flesh, and a piece of it, soaked briefly in water to reduce the salt and then cooked, is very different from fresh pork, denser in texture and more intensely flavored. Its protein changed by the salt in ways that make it cook differently, firmer and more chewy, with a concentrated savor that spreads through a broth more effectively than fresh meat would. Winter days are short. The sun, when it appears, rises late and sets early and never rises very high in the sky, giving its light at a low angle that makes everything look slightly gold, even at midday. Everything cast in long shadows, and a quality of light that feels like late afternoon, even at noon. The family is indoors more in winter, the children underfoot, the work that can be done in limited light, carried on by the fire, the spinning and the mending and the making of small useful things, basket weaving or the carving of a spoon, the repairing of tools and harness. And yet winter has its feast days, its moments of gathering and celebration that break the long gray monotony with something brighter and warmer. Christmas, celebrated over 12 days, was a time when even ordinary people tried to eat better than usual, when the lord of the village might distribute extra food, or when a community feast was organized in the church hall, when there might be extra ale and perhaps a goose or more pork than the usual day's portion, when spices might make a very unusual appearance. Spices in medieval Europe are worth a gentle pause. Pepper, cinnamon, ginger, nutmegs, cloves. These are the flavors we associate most strongly with the spice trade that was one of the defining economic forces of the medieval and early modern period. But they were expensive, imported from the distant east along trade routes that involved many hands and many fees, and by the time they reached northern Europe, they cost enough that they were effectively out of reach for ordinary people most of the time. A wealthy household used spices liberally, not just for flavor, but as a display of wealth, a demonstration that they could afford these exotic and expensive things. An ordinary household used them very rarely, if at all, perhaps a small amount of ginger or pepper, acquired as a special purchase for a feast day, measured out in tiny pinches, and used with the reverence that expensive things warrant. The flavors that ordinary people used to season their food were instead the herbs of the garden and the hedgerow, the salt of preservation, the sourness of fermented things, the gentle sweetness of onions and leeks, cooked long, the earthiness of mushrooms and roots, the mild bitterness of dark greens. These are not the complex, layered, spiced flavors of wealthy medieval cooking, but they are real and good flavors, the flavors of the landscape and the season expressed through the pot. For feast days, for Christmas or Easter or the village's patron saint's day, the food was still the same basic food, made from the same basic ingredients, but with more of everything. More meat, perhaps, more fat used in the cooking, a little more ale, a little more bread, the pot more full than usual, the meal longer and more leisurely, eaten in the company of neighbors and family gathered together in a way that did not happen on ordinary days. The communal aspect of medieval village life around food is something worth resting on for a moment, because in some ways, it is one of the most important things about how ordinary people ate and experienced food in this period. Villages were not made up of isolated households simply existing side by side. They were genuinely communal in many of their activities. The fields worked communally in the sense that the strip system required everyone to follow the same planting and harvest schedule. The animals grazed on the common land that everyone shared. The oven, where it existed, was used communally, people bringing their loaves to be baked in a shared fire at a time arranged by the baker. Women who were baking would sometimes share ingredients or labor, one kneading while another tended the fire. The knowledge of good bread shared between experienced hands. A neighbor who had an abundance of one thing this season might share a little with someone who had run short of another, because next season or next year the situation might be reversed. Food at celebrations was explicitly communal. The feast held in the church or in the open space of the village common when the weather allowed, everyone contributing what they could and everyone eating together. The barriers of individual households dissolved for a time in the shared warmth of a collective meal. These feasts were important, not just nutritionally, but socially, reinforcing the bonds of the community, giving people a sense of belonging and mutual support that was, in a world without most of the institutions of modern welfare, a genuine form of security. The lord of the manor, the person who owned or controlled the land that peasants worked, had obligations as well as rights in this system. At harvest time, the lord's workers, the villagers doing their labor service on his land, were to be fed. At Christmas, there might be a distribution of food or ale. These were understood obligations, customary rights that ordinary people expected and sometimes demanded, and the lord who failed to honor them risked real discontent. Food moved through the social hierarchy in both directions, upward as rent and tithes and labor, and downward as customary gifts and obligations, a circulation that held the whole system together in its imperfect and often unjust, but also surprisingly durable way. Let the firelight hold us for a moment more. The spring is coming eventually. It is always coming. The days are getting very slightly longer in an almost imperceptible way. The sky still gray and cold, but the gray beginning to have a different quality to it. Not the flat, opaque gray of deep winter, but something a little lighter, a little more open, as though the sky itself is beginning to wake. The first signs of spring in the kitchen garden are small things, easy to miss if you are not looking. The overwintered leeks that have been standing through the cold are beginning to put out new growth at their centers, a pale green interior pushing up through the outer layers that have died back. The kale, still standing, still dark green, has a look of having survived something and being ready to grow again. In the warmest corner of the garden, against the south-facing wall of the cottage, where the thatch overhang keeps off the worst of the rain and the stone absorbs a little extra warmth from whatever sun gets through, something small and green is beginning to push up from the soil. The first herb shoots, perhaps, or the very first of the spring onions planted last autumn. The pot on the fire is a little lighter in this season, the dense winter pottage giving way to something thinner and greener. The first of the new greens cut and added, the leek tops that have come up fresh and sweet, the nettle shoots that appear in the hedgerow in early spring, gathered with gloves or with a cloth wrapped around the hands to protect against the sting, and then put into hot water or into the pot, where the heat immediately neutralizes the sting and turns them into something soft and deeply green, tasting of iron and grass and the particular mineral richness that nettles carry. Nettles in early spring are one of the real pleasures of this diet, in a way that it is easy to overlook. They appear just when winter stores are running very low and before garden vegetables have produced much, and they are free and plentiful, growing in any uncultivated corner, and they are surprisingly nutritious, rich in iron and other minerals and vitamins, in a way that makes them genuinely beneficial after a long winter of stored food. Nettle pottage, or nettles added to whatever else is in the pot, brings a freshness to the food that must have been very welcome after months of dried peas and salted pork. And with spring come the eggs again. The chickens, whose laying slows through the dark winter months, begin to lay more reliably as the days get longer and the light returns, and eggs begin to appear in the small wooden nest boxes with a frequency that makes them available for cooking again, rather than being rationed carefully one at a time. An egg boiled in water and eaten with bread and a little salt, an egg broken into a pan with a little lard and cooked until the white is just set, an egg beaten with a little milk or water and stirred into pottage to enrich it. These simple preparations have been missed through the winter, and their return marks something. The goat or the cow is giving more milk again as the pasture greens up and the animals are able to feed well. Fresh milk after months of little or none is rich and sweet and slightly thick, a very different experience from the preserved and stored products of winter. Fresh cheese made quickly from this spring milk, hung in a cloth to drain overnight, is soft and white and mild and slightly sour, eaten with bread and salt or crumbled into pottage, a simple fresh food that tastes of the new season. And slowly, slowly, the year turns again toward summer, toward the long light days and the abundance of the growing season, the garden full of things, and the hedgerow full of things, and the fields moving toward harvest, and the pot on the fire beginning to hold brighter and more varied things. Fresh peas still in their pods, just split open, and the peas tumbled in, brilliant green and sweet. Young carrots just pulled from the earth and added whole, a handful of fresh herbs whose green is vivid against the pale broth. Summer pottage is a different meal from winter pottage. It has freshness in it, brightness, the quality of things just cut from the growing plant and put straight into the pot with almost no handling needed. The broth is lighter and greener, and the vegetables in it are tender and soft, not the dense breaking down of dried peas, but the quick yielding of fresh young things to gentle heat. It smells of the garden and of summer and of the fire that is now less necessary for warmth than for cooking, still burning but smaller, maintained rather than built up. The summer diet of a medieval peasant is, in some ways, the best time of year for food, the most varied and most fresh, the most giving of what the land has to offer, and it coincides with the long days that allow more hours of work, which means more need for the nourishment the food provides, and also more opportunity to gather and preserve what summer offers in abundance against the time when it will not be available. The making of cheese, the drying of herbs, the gathering and drying of mushrooms, the salting of fish when a barrel of herring becomes available, the storing of apples in the cool dark of the root cellar, the making of a good large batch of ale while the weather is warm enough to help the fermentation along. All of this preserving and storing work goes on through summer and into autumn, building the supplies that will carry the family through another winter. And the cycle closes and opens again. There is something very old and very quiet in that cycle, in the patient turning of the year and the patient adaptation of what is eaten to what is available. It does not require sentimentality to appreciate it, only a kind of attention, a willingness to sit with it and let its rhythm enter the mind and the body alongside the thoughts. The peasant who woke before dawn to grind the grain and build the fire and put the pot on was not thinking about any of this in abstract terms. She was thinking about breakfast, about what the children would eat, about whether the peas would be soft enough by midday. The mundane and the profound were the same thing in a life like that, the simple act of feeding a family being the entire project, the whole purpose, the reason the long day of work made sense. Now it is very late in the evening in the cottage. The fire has been banked down for the night, the large pieces of wood placed carefully to burn slowly without attention, the damper positioned to slow the draw of air through the fire and let it breathe rather than burn. The orange light it gives is dimmer now, more ember than flame, casting a reddish warmth on the faces of the sleeping family. Everyone is asleep. The youngest child has curled deeply into the sleeping pallet, pulled the thin blanket all the way over her head, so only her hair is visible, dark against the straw-colored linen. The boy is on his back, with his arms slightly spread, the deep, ungracious sleep of a child who has used their body completely during the day. The elder girl, who was watching the firelight earlier, has closed her eyes somewhere in the past hour and is breathing slowly and evenly, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of very deep sleep. The mother and father lie beside each other on their own pallet, close together in the way of people who share warmth as well as rest, and they are quiet, completely quiet, in the way that people are quiet when they have worked hard and eaten simply and have no reason to stay awake. The pot on the fire is still, whatever remains of the evening's pottage, cooling slowly in the dimming heat. The surface gone calm and slightly thickened where the starches have settled. The rushlight burned out an hour ago, and has not been replaced. The only light in the room is the ember glow of the fire, and it is very gentle, very red, very soft, and it illuminates nothing clearly, but gives just enough warmth in its color to know that it is there. Outside, the night is deep and perfectly dark, the sky overhead, not visible from inside the cottage, but there nonetheless, thick with stars that no competing light has dimmed, the old stars in their old patterns, the same stars that will be there next winter and the winter after, the same stars that were there for the people who lived in this cottage before this family and the people who will live here after. The village is silent. The fire breathes. And the night holds everything in it, very quietly. The bread and the broth and the grain and the garden and the long, slow, patient work of ordinary life. All of it resting now, resting under the dark sky, resting in the warmth of the banked fire, resting in the deep, unhurried sleep of people who have done what a day asked of them and need nothing from the night except its quiet and its darkness and its slow turning toward morning. In a little while, just a little while, the sky will begin to lighten almost imperceptibly at the horizon, and the fire will still be breathing, and the pot will still be hanging on its hook, and somewhere in the cottage a woman will stir before the others, her body knowing, before her mind does, that the day is beginning. And she will reach for the embers, and she will breathe gently onto them. And the flame will appear, small and wavering and pale, reaching upward in the dark. And the water will go into the pot, and the grain will go under the stone. And the day will begin again in its quiet, patient, unbroken way, the same as yesterday, the same as the day before, the same as it will be tomorrow. The bread will be heavy and brown and smell of the fire. The pottage will be warm and gentle and smell of leeks and peas and the dried thyme from the bundle above. The family will gather at the board and eat in the particular quiet of real hunger met by real food, and then they will go out into whatever the day is, cold or wet or gray or briefly bright, into the fields and the garden and the lane and in the village, into the ordinary texture of a life that did not ask much of itself except to continue, to persist, to be here tomorrow the same as it is today. Let all of that settle into you now, very gently, the weight of the wooden spoon, the sound of the grain under the stone, the smell of the pot beginning to warm, the warmth of the fire against a face turned toward it in the half-dark of early morning. Nothing is rushing anywhere. Nothing is asking for your attention except this: the fire, the pot, the bread, the quiet turning of another day. Let yourself rest now as the cottage rests, as the fire rests in its careful banking, as the village rests under the dark and patient sky. There is nothing needed from you tonight except to let the warmth of this reach you. Let the slow rhythm of it carry you. Let the ordinary and ancient goodness of bread and broth and a fire in the dark be enough, because it is enough. It always was. Slowly, gently, the fire breathes, the night holds, and you rest.